The morning of April 13th, 2011, began like any other in Parsons, Tennessee, quiet, gentle, the kind of morning where the only sounds were coffee dripping and birds testing their voices in the pines. Inside the modest brick house at the edge of the woods, 20-year-old Holly Bobo moved softly through her routine. Her nursing textbook lay open on the counter, pages filled with neat highlights and notes, small proofs of a young woman planning for a bright future. Outside, the air still carried the cool breath of dawn. Dew clung to the grass as Holly stepped into the carport, sunlight glinting off her hair. From his window, her brother Clint watched her, half awake, protective, and unaware that in seconds, his life was about to fracture. A man in camouflage walked up the driveway toward Holly. To Clint, it looked harmless, even familiar. Maybe her boyfriend dropping by early. Maybe just another morning. But something in her posture, the stiffness of her shoulders, the way she hesitated, didn't fit the scene. You can almost feel it too, that tightening in your gut when normal suddenly feels wrong. You'd tell yourself it's nothing. You'd blink, look again, and by then, it would be too late. Holly turned toward the woods with the man at her side. The trees swallowed them in silence. Her phone still on the counter, coffee still warm, life still waiting for her to return, but she never would. For 3 long years, her family would chase shadows, her community would cling to hope, and investigators would fill folders thicker than Bibles trying to find her. And when the truth finally surfaced, it would shatter everything they thought they knew about safety, about neighbors, about evil hiding in plain sight. This isn't just another disappearance. This is one of Tennessee's most haunting cold case files. Drop your city and the time right now, because what happens next will stay with you. The world had just begun to wake when the clock on the Bobo family's kitchen wall clicked past. 7:30 a.m. The light in Parsons, Tennessee, that morning was soft and golden, slipping between the trees like a secret. Inside the house, the air smelled of coffee and toast, ordinary scents that would later become unbearable reminders of what was lost. Holly Bobo moved through the kitchen in a quiet rhythm that spoke of discipline and routine. Her nursing uniform, a soft pink, hung pressed and ready. Her books were stacked neatly beside her purse. Every gesture, pouring coffee, checking the time, tightening her ponytail, was part of a well-rehearsed morning dance. She was a creature of purpose, her life carefully organized around school, church, and family. She had dreams that stretched far beyond this small town of 500 souls. Friends said she wanted to work in pediatrics, to bring comfort to sick children, helping others heal. She had once written in her college essay. It wasn't ambition that drove her, it was kindness. Her parents, Dana and Karen Bobo, had already left for work that morning. The only one home was her older brother, Clint, still in his room, guitar propped in the corner, half listening to the morning news. Outside, the woods behind their house shimmered in the soft light, the same woods where they had played as children, where Clint had taught Holly to ride a four-wheeler and to spot deer tracks after rain. The forest was safety. Home. Familiar. You'd think your backyard was the safest place on earth. Until it isn't. At 7:40, Clint heard movement outside, the faint scrape of shoes on gravel, a murmur of voices. He glanced through his bedroom window, expecting to see his sister heading to her car. Instead, his gaze locked on something that froze his breath. A man in camouflage stood beside Holly, close, too close, his hand resting lightly on her arm. Clint hesitated. The man's hunting gear looked familiar. Plenty of men around Parsons wore it daily. Holly's boyfriend, Drew Scott, often dropped by before class. Clint's sleepy mind rationalized what his instincts tried to reject. The man's posture seemed calm, almost protective, as if leading Holly somewhere. There was no shouting, no visible struggle. He watched for another moment, uneasy. Holly's movements, though they weren't casual. Her shoulders were rigid, her steps hesitant. She wasn't walking with him, she was being guided. Something in the air, the quiet too thick, the morning too still, pressed against his chest like a warning. Then, before Clint could decide what to do, they disappeared past the tree line. For a heartbeat, silence reclaimed the yard. Just the birds, the hum of the TV, and the faint smell of coffee. Clint blinked, unsure if what he'd seen had even been real. He told himself it was fine. It had to be fine. He waited for the sound of her car starting, the usual sign that Holly was leaving for school. But minutes passed. The driveway remained still. At 8. 0, unease began to gnaw. He walked into the kitchen. Holly's phone sat on the counter. Her car keys, 2. Her bag untouched. On the stove, the coffee she'd poured was still warm. He picked up the phone, dialed her number anyway, just in case she'd taken a walk outside. The ringtone sounded from the very counter in front of him. His stomach dropped. He tried Drew next. The boyfriend answered immediately, his voice calm, confused. "No, man," Drew said. "I'm not there. I'm at work." 8. The world tilted. If that wasn't Drew, then who was with Holly? A cold panic flooded Clint's chest. He ran from room to room, calling her name, checking the yard, the edge of the woods. Nothing. Only stillness, as if the earth itself had swallowed her. The human mind in crisis doesn't always move rationally. It freezes. The fight, flight, or freeze response isn't a choice. It's a survival glitch. Clint's body chose paralysis. His brain, overwhelmed by disbelief, clung to the possibility of misunderstanding. It's only later, in the echo chamber of guilt, that logic returns, too late to help. He called his parents. His words stumbled out, camouflage, woods, gone. His father's voice cracked into focus. "We're on our way." 8. At 8:42 a.m. Dana Bobo's voice reached the 911 dispatcher. Calm but trembling. "My daughter's missing." Those 3 words would fracture the illusion of safety that had held Parsons together for generations. Within an hour, the yard that once hosted barbecues and Sunday laughter turned into a command post. Deputies rolled up first, followed by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the wind, a cruel contrast to the bright morning sun. Neighbors gathered silently behind it, disbelief etched on every face. The woods, once familiar and alive, now looked sinister. The shadows seemed to breathe. Officers combed through the underbrush, marking evidence, collecting footprints, searching for any sign of where Holly had gone. They found small traces, a lunch bag, a hair tie, each one a whisper of her presence, each one another twist of the knife for her family. Back inside, Clint sat at the kitchen table, his hands shaking, eyes fixed on his sister's open textbook. His mind replayed the scene again and again, searching for a detail he'd missed, something that could undo the last hour. But memory is a cruel witness. It records, but it never forgives. Psychologists call it survivor's guilt. When tragedy happens within reach, the witness often becomes a prisoner of what-ifs. What if I had shouted? What if I had run outside? What if I had trusted my gut? For Clint, those questions became a chorus that would haunt his nights for years. He didn't know that his sister's abduction would stretch into one of Tennessee's longest and most agonizing investigations. He only knew that every second of hesitation now felt like a betrayal. Outside, the media began to arrive, first local crews, then regional ones. Parsons, a town where everyone knew everyone, suddenly became the epicenter of national attention. Reporters filled the air with words like mystery, abduction, and vanishing. But behind those headlines was something much rawer, a family living the longest day of their lives. By noon, search teams spread into the surrounding woods and fields. Volunteers, farmers, church members, old classmates formed lines and moved through the trees, calling Holly's name. Some carried flashlights even though it was daylight. Others carried Bibles. You can almost feel that helpless rhythm, voices echoing her name, the silence answering back. Back at the house, Marie Bobo returned from work, still in her nurse's scrubs. When she saw the police cars, she didn't have to ask. Her legs gave out before she reached the porch. Clint caught her mid-fall, his own tears finally breaking free. For hours, the mother clutched Holly's phone to her chest as if warmth alone might bring her daughter back. She prayed and whispered fragments, her faith colliding with terror. When friends suggested rest, she refused. "If I stop," she said, "I'll start believing she's gone." 8. In the days that followed, Clint's guilt hardened into silence. He replayed every second before Holly disappeared, analyzing each detail until his mind blurred. Therapists would later explain that he had experienced acute dissociation, the mind protecting itself from trauma by shutting down. But understanding that didn't erase the pain. You can almost picture it. A brother staring out the same window morning after morning, wishing for a do-over that never comes. In that fragile state, the Bobo family made a pact to keep Holly's story alive. They spoke to the press, printed flyers, organized searches. But beneath every effort was the same unspoken truth. The woods had taken her, and no one knew why. By the end of that first day, the sun sank behind the trees that had swallowed Holly whole. The searchers returned, their flashlights dimming. The family stood together on the porch, the world unnaturally quiet. Somewhere in that silence, a terrible question began to take root, one that would define the next 3 years of their lives. 8. Who took her? If this were your sister, what would you have done? Comment below, because guilt doesn't fade, it festers. By noon, the quiet town of Parsons had transformed. The hum of helicopters replaced the morning stillness, their blades chopping through the air above the rolling Tennessee hills. From the sky, the patchwork of farmland and forest looked peaceful, but on the ground, that peace had shattered. Sheriff's deputies marked off the Bobo property with yellow tape that snapped in the breeze. Every few minutes, another vehicle arrived, search and rescue teams, TBI agents, K-9 units. What had been a family's driveway now looked like a command post. Folding tables littered with maps and coffee cups appeared under a white tent. Handwritten notes filled with grid coordinates were pinned to a board that read, Operation Holly Bobo. Neighbors stood at the edge of the property, silent, hands clasped in disbelief. Some came offering food, others simply stood there, as if presence alone could help. Word of mouth traveled faster than any official announcement. By mid-afternoon, volunteers from nearby towns began to arrive, farmers in mud-stained boots, students still wearing backpacks, retirees who hadn't been in the woods in years. No one needed to be asked twice. In towns like Parsons, when tragedy strikes one family, it strikes them all. Teams formed quickly, each handed a section of map and a walkie-talkie. They moved into the woods in methodical lines, their calls of Holly echoing through the trees. Each shout was both a prayer and a plea. From above, the helicopters hovered low, the searchlights slicing through canopies of oak and pine. Dogs barked as they caught scents, sometimes leading to old deer trails, other times to nothing at all. Every discovery, a scrap of fabric, a footprint, a hair clip, sent a tremor of hope through the crowd, only to dissolve when tested. Inside the family home, Marie Bobo moved like a ghost through familiar rooms. The sound of radios and boots outside didn't register. She was trapped in her own rhythm, wiping the already clean counters, straightening the same photo frames, refilling the same untouched coffee cup. Trauma psychologists call it denial through ritual. For Marie, repetition became the only way to survive the chaos that had invaded her house. And when evening came, she did something that caught even the detectives off guard. She set the dinner table for 4. Forks aligned perfectly, plates gleaming in the fading light. Holly's place, her favorite floral plate, sat waiting. Dana tried gently to stop her. "Honey," he said, voice breaking, "you don't have to." "Eights." But she interrupted, her hands trembling. "If she comes home hungry, she'll know we're ready." Eights. To outsiders, it looked like denial. To Marie, it was faith in physical form, a ritual that said hope still lives here. Out by the churchyard, crowds gathered for an impromptu prayer vigil. Candles flickered against the rising night. People who barely knew the Bobos found themselves shoulder to shoulder with those who'd grown up with them. The pastor's voice rose over the hum of insects and news vans. "Lord, guide her home." Eights. And you can almost hear her name echo across the fields, because when hope is all that's left, you hold it tight. Over the next week, Parsons turned into a living organism powered by faith and fear. The command post at New Hope Baptist Church became its beating heart. Volunteers rotated in shifts. Churches cooked casseroles and chili for search teams. Farmers brought ATVs. Teenagers distributed water bottles. Hunters who knew every acre of those woods led search lines into places too thick for vehicles. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation logged hundreds of tips. Every few hours, someone thought they'd seen something, a truck matching a description, a noise near a creek, a strange light in the woods. Each lead was pursued with desperate energy, but the woods always swallowed their answers. The community psyche began to shift. In the first days, everyone believed Holly would be found alive. But as hours turned into days, fear crept in. People double-locked their doors for the first time. Mothers called daughters twice a day. Men who once left car keys in the ignition now checked their yards with flashlights before bed. In small towns, evil isn't supposed to be local. It's supposed to belong to somewhere else, the city, the highway, the news. Parsons, for the first time, had to face the truth that monsters sometimes grow up next door. Psychologists who later studied the Bobo case noted how collective trauma formed almost instantly. Shared fear binds people together, but it also reshapes them. The same neighbors who prayed together now looked at one another with quiet suspicion. Rumors bloomed like weeds. "Did you hear who they questioned?" "I saw a strange truck yesterday." "Maybe she ran away." Eights. The church bulletin board, once reserved for bake sales and choir schedules, now held flyers with Holly's smiling photo, a young woman with bright eyes and soft hair, frozen forever in that moment before everything changed. The national media descended next. Satellite trucks parked along Parsons Road, cameras turning toward the small white church that had become the town's anchor. Reporters called it the Tennessee Mystery. Producers wanted footage of grieving faces, but Marie avoided the cameras. She stayed inside, talking to search coordinators, answering questions, refusing to cry in public. Dana, her husband, spoke quietly to anyone who would listen. "She's out there," he kept repeating. "She's out there somewhere." 8. On the 7th day, exhaustion began to settle over the volunteers. Faces that had been determined now looked hollowed out. Some searchers returned home crying, ashamed that they hadn't found anything. But still, they came back the next morning. The unspoken rule was simple. Until she's found, we don't stop. In moments like these, faith and fear become indistinguishable. People pray harder when the darkness closes in, not necessarily because they expect a miracle, but because prayer gives the illusion of control in a world that's spinning apart. At night, Marie would walk into Holly's room, sit on the edge of her bed, and talk to her as if she were just late from class. "I left the light on for you," she'd whisper. The air smelled faintly of her daughter's shampoo. Some nights she'd fall asleep there, waking up with the imprint of Holly's pillow on her cheek. Clint, meanwhile, retreated inward. His world had split in two, before the morning and after. Every knock on the door jolted him. Every police car made his heart race. The weight of what if followed him like a shadow. He began writing notes in a small spiral notebook, details of the man he saw, the clothes, the walk, the sound of their voices. It wasn't a coping mechanism, it was penance. The TBI agents noticed his distress, but treated him gently. They'd seen this kind of trauma before. Witnesses whose guilt turned them into investigators, searching for redemption through memory. Days turned into weeks. The woods were combed again and again, the riverbanks dredged, fields scanned by drones. Holly's story appeared on national networks, joining the long, sorrowful list of missing women across America. Her case file grew thicker with every dead end. By summer, Parsons had adjusted to a new rhythm, one that balanced daily life with the constant ache of absence. Children went to school, church bells rang, stores reopened, but beneath everything pulsed the same unresolved dread. Every anniversary, 1 month, 2 months, 3, the community gathered again to pray. Hope became ritual, just like Marie's dinner table. People lit candles, sang hymns, and promised they wouldn't forget. Marie refused to put away Holly's things. Her clothes stayed folded in drawers. Her perfume bottle remained on the dresser. When friends suggested cleaning the room to help her move on, she shook her head. "If I start cleaning," she said, "I'll be admitting she's not coming home." 8. That was her form of survival, denial not as ignorance, but as defiance. It was her way of saying to the world, "My daughter's story isn't over yet." Psychologically, Marie embodied what grief counselors call frozen hope. It's a state where faith and pain coexist, a refusal to give up even when reason says to. For her, hope was oxygen. To let it go would be to suffocate. By the end of that first year, the emotional toll on Parsons was visible. Some volunteers stopped coming, not because they stopped caring, but because living inside uncertainty was draining their souls. Others couldn't stop. Searching became part of their identity. For the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the Holly Bobo disappearance turned into one of the state's most extensive manhunts. Detectives worked quietly, chasing leads across counties, running DNA tests, interrogating potential suspects. Every tip reopened the wound for the family. Each call from the TBI carried the same fragile balance of dread and hope. And yet, despite the tireless work, months became years. Holly's name remained unsolved, her image plastered on missing posters, fading from sunlight and rain. You can imagine the loneliness of that kind of waiting. 3 birthdays, 3 Christmases, 3 empty chairs, the dinner plate still set each evening, the candle still burning in the window. Marie's nightly ritual became something sacred. At 8 p.m., she would light a candle and pray aloud for Holly. Neighbors began to join her from their own homes, lighting candles too. From above, the small town of Parsons shimmered faintly at night, tiny points of light flickering like constellations of hope. Reporters who returned to cover anniversary vigils often remarked on how peaceful the town looked, how faith seemed to hold it together. But anyone who lived there knew peace was an illusion. Beneath the hymns and candlelight, fear still thrummed. For 3 years, this would become one of Tennessee's most haunting cold case files, a mystery carved into the community's heart, unresolved but unforgettable. The story of Holly Bobo wasn't just about one missing woman anymore. It was about the collective soul of a town that refused to surrender. It was about how ordinary people, teachers, hunters, mothers, pastors, confronted the abyss and chose, every day, to hope anyway. And when that hope finally collided with truth, 3 years later, the shock would ripple through every heart that had ever whispered her name into the dark. The helicopters eventually left, but the silence they left behind felt heavier than their noise. The search maps came down. The posters began to fade. But inside the TBI's offices, the work never stopped. The files labeled Bobo, Holly L. continued to grow, page after page of witness statements, evidence logs, and unanswered questions. The case had gone cold to the public, but for the investigators, it was just beginning to burn. When the last volunteer packed up and the final candle burned down, the investigation shifted from the open fields of Parsons to the fluorescent halls of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. The TBI's headquarters in Nashville didn't look like a place where hope lived. It looked like a place where hope was cataloged, logged, and stapled into manila folders. By late 2011, the Holly Bobo disappearance had become one of the most demanding cases the Bureau had ever handled. The search teams had turned up fragments, pieces of fabric, impressions in mud, tire tracks, but nothing conclusive. Every week, detectives drove hundreds of miles, following tips that went nowhere. The whiteboard in the conference room was a web of names, addresses, and possible sightings, a tangle of leads that seemed to mock them. Detective Terry Dykes, one of the lead investigators, kept a cot in his office. His wife once joked that she'd started sleeping on his side of the bed just to remember what rest felt like. But there was nothing humorous about the toll this case was taking. Each new lead arrived with a flicker of adrenaline and ended with the hollow fatigue of disappointment. Someone claimed to have heard screams near the river. Another said they saw a white truck speeding away from the woods. A fisherman found a shoe downstream. Another found a purse near a bridge. Every item became evidence, bagged, labeled, and eventually shelved. The TBI's cold case files grew thicker by the month, filled with names that led nowhere. Inside those folders were lives, suspects, witnesses, neighbors, even family friends, people who, for a time, lived under the shadow of suspicion. For detectives, that's one of the cruel ironies of investigation. To find the truth, you must first suspect everyone. By early 2012, the Bobo case had attracted national media attention. News anchors called it the Tennessee mystery that won't go away. True crime programs aired reconstructions of the disappearance, actors playing Holly and the man in camouflage under eerie music. Every broadcast brought a new wave of attention, but also new rumors. On social media, strangers became self-appointed detectives, dissecting photos, analyzing interviews, and sharing conspiracy theories that would take months for the TBI to disprove. Investigators had to separate real information from noise, facts from fantasies. The town, once bound by unity, began to splinter under the weight of speculation. Everyone's talking, one resident told a reporter. Everyone's got a theory. Nobody's got the truth. Eights. And you start to wonder if truth even wants to be found. From an investigator's perspective, the line between obsession and duty blurs quickly. Detective Dicus spent so many nights poring over the same aerial maps that he began seeing patterns in the trees. He'd wake at 3 a.m., convinced that some detail, some overlooked intersection of roads or creek beds, held the answer. Then he'd drive there before dawn, flashlight in hand, looking for meaning in shadows. His team called it the loop. The cycle of chasing a lead, finding nothing, then chasing the next. Psychologists working with law enforcement have a term for it: burnout by repetition. It's the silent cost of long-term investigations. The gradual erosion of faith. Meanwhile, the Bobos lived in suspended animation. Marie's nightly candle ritual continued. Dana worked longer hours just to stay distracted. Clint stopped attending community gatherings altogether. Every few months, TBI agents would visit the house to update them. Sometimes they brought hope, new lab results, new interviews. Other times, only silence. Each visit reopened the wound. Each unanswered question deepened it. In February 2013, nearly 2 years after the disappearance, the TBI held a closed-door meeting to reassess the case. On the wall were photos of every potential suspect, maps of search grids, and a timeline of events. The investigators debated theories like lawyers preparing for trial. Eights. Was it a random abduction or someone she knew? Was the camouflage intentional or just coincidence? Why did the trail go cold so quickly after the woods? Dicus stared at the timeline. The first 10 minutes of that morning, he said quietly, are all that matters. Somewhere in those 10 minutes is every answer we need. Eights. But 10 minutes can stretch into eternity when no one is left to speak. The physical evidence was frustratingly limited. DNA samples were inconclusive. Tire impressions didn't match any registered vehicles in the county. Even the cell phone pings, one of the few digital clues, were erratic, bouncing off towers that covered dozens of square miles. The TBI analysts ran every combination of data, each time hoping for a pattern that would lead to Holly's location. Instead, the algorithm returned what they already knew. Nothing coherent, nothing solid, nothing human. Detective Dicus began keeping a personal notebook separate from official records. In it, he wrote observations that didn't fit anywhere else. Why did the brother hesitate? Could the man have been familiar to her? Is it possible she knew him? Eights. These weren't accusations. They were reflections of a man drowning in uncertainty. By spring 2013, the investigation had reached its psychological breaking point. Even within the TBI, morale was low. Some agents requested transfers. Others quietly confessed that the case haunted them. One investigator admitted to seeing Holly's face in his dreams, always walking away into the woods, always just out of reach. The Bureau's director authorized a new strategy: re-interview every major witness from the beginning. Start over. Reset the board. That meant revisiting old pain, especially for Clint. When agents sat with him again, he described the man's voice, his posture, the subtle difference in how Holly moved that morning. He cried during the interview for the first time, overwhelmed by the years of holding it in. The agents didn't record that part in their notes, but they remembered it. Empathy doesn't solve cases, but it fuels perseverance. Across the small town, suspicion became a contagion. Every rumor magnified fear. Some believed it was a stranger passing through. Others whispered it was someone local. A few even accused the Bobo family themselves, repeating online conspiracy theories without shame. It's one of the darkest realities of modern investigation. When truth hides too long, people start inventing their own. You'd think small towns are built on trust, but trust fractures easily under the weight of unsolved tragedy. The media frenzy didn't help. National networks returned to Parsons for anniversary specials, filming drone shots of the woods and the family's home. They wanted emotion, not facts. They wanted tears. They wanted closure that didn't exist. Marie, who once avoided reporters, finally agreed to an interview, not to fuel gossip, but to refocus attention on her daughter's humanity. "She's not a headline," she said firmly. "She's my little girl, and I'm not stopping until she comes home." Eights. Her composure stunned viewers. For investigators, it reignited urgency. But urgency can't replace evidence. Behind the scenes, the TBI expanded its task force. More agents, more analysts, more sleepless nights. The case file, once a single binder, now filled 2 filing cabinets. Each drawer a monument to persistence and failure. One night, Detective Dykes sat alone under the harsh office light, reviewing an evidence photo for what felt like the 100th time. A piece of torn camouflage fabric. It had been tested repeatedly, stored, and nearly forgotten. But something about it, its angle, the tear pattern, nagged at him. He sent it back for retesting with the latest DNA extraction methods. Weeks later, the results returned. Partial male DNA, but no match in the system. Another spark extinguished. That was the cruel rhythm of this case. Hope, test, disappointment, repeat. Even the most devoted investigators began to question themselves. Were they missing something obvious? Were they too close to see clearly? One agent compared it to staring at a jigsaw puzzle missing half its pieces. Eights. The turning point came in early 2014, not from new technology, but from human error finally corrected. A small-town informant, dismissed early in the case for unreliability, resurfaced with a story that seemed implausible. He claimed to know men who had bragged about what happened to that Bobo girl. Eights. Normally, such claims would be discarded. But desperation breeds open minds. The TBI followed up quietly. What they uncovered next would shatter Parsons' fragile calm. The names were familiar, too familiar. Men from within 20 miles of the Bobo home. Faces seen in grocery stores, at local gas stations, even at church. But before investigators could act, the rumor leaked. Someone in town overheard, and by the next morning, whispers spread faster than facts. "Did you hear? They think it's locals." Eights. Not strangers, our own. Eights. The realization was more terrifying than any unknown monster. Evil hadn't come from outside. It had been living among them all along. Would you still trust your neighbors after this? Let me know below. The psychological impact on the community was devastating. For 3 years, they had prayed together, searched together, eaten at the same tables. Now, suspicion poisoned those bonds. People avoided eye contact. Conversations died mid-sentence. For the investigators, this was progress, dark, painful progress. Every interview revealed connections. Shared acquaintances, overlapping hangouts, mutual debts. The net was tightening. Behind closed doors, Dykes felt the familiar spark of adrenaline, tempered now with dread. He knew that arresting locals would divide Parsons forever. But he also knew that justice demanded it. The case that had once frozen now began to thaw. Slowly, uneasily. The TBI's cold case files, once symbols of frustration, now pulsed with new life. Inside those worn pages lay the first clues to the truth that had eluded them for nearly 3 years. For the Bobo family, the calls from investigators took on a new tone, not hopeful yet, but heavy with implication. Marie didn't ask for details. She just asked one question. Are you close? Ates and Dicus, exhausted and gray from years without rest, finally said something he hadn't said before. We're closer than we've ever been. Ates. But even he didn't yet understand the horror that closeness would reveal. Because sometimes, when you stare long enough into the shadows stare back. By early 2014, the Tennessee winter had given the woods around Parsons a dull, colorless stillness. The leaves were gone, the fields brittle with frost. 3 years had passed since Holly vanished, and though the town had learned to live around its grief, no one had learned to live with it. People spoke her name less often now, not because they'd forgotten, but because saying it out loud still hurt too much. Then, one February morning, the silence broke. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation called a press conference. The reporters who had long since packed up their cameras came rushing back. Within minutes, satellite vans lined the street outside the TBI's Jackson office. Locals gathered around their televisions, hearts pounding, expecting another vague update, another plea for patience. But what they heard instead sent a shockwave through every church, every gas station, every kitchen table in Parsons. The TBI had made an arrest. A name flashed across the screen. Zachary Rye Adams, age 29, from Holiday, Tennessee, less than 30 minutes from the Bobo home. For years, his name had lingered on the edges of whispers, a troublemaker, a drug user, a man with a violent temper. But rumors were one thing, proof was another. Now, the Bureau had both. When agents arrived at Adams' property that morning, they found the scene almost cinematic in its quiet dread. A small, weathered house at the end of a gravel road. A junked-out pickup. A dog barking somewhere in the distance. As officers placed him in handcuffs, Adams smiled, a slow, chilling smirk that several witnesses later said they'd never forget. The official charges were read out later that day. Especially aggravated kidnapping and first-degree murder. Marie Bobo sat at her kitchen table when the news came through the radio. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. After 3 years of praying for answers, she finally had one, but it came wrapped in horror. Relief and terror collided inside her like opposing storms. If Zachary Adams had taken Holly, that meant her daughter was gone for good. The family gathered in silence. Clint clenched his jaw, staring at the wall, tears pooling in his eyes. Dana reached for Marie's hand, but couldn't find words. The house that had once buzzed with hope now felt like a tomb, filled with the echoes of all the prayers that hadn't been answered the way they wanted. You'd think you know your hometown, until the monster wears a familiar face. News of Adams's arrest tore through Parsons like wildfire. Neighbors who had once shared meals with him, waved to him at gas stations, or bought tools from his family's business stared at his mugshot on TV and felt physically ill. He was just one of us, one resident said. I never thought he could be capable of something like that. Ates. But that's what made it worse. The betrayal wasn't just about Holly. It was about the illusion of safety. Evil hadn't crept in from the outside world. It had been hiding behind a local smile. Within weeks, more arrests followed. Adams's cousin, Dylan Adams, was charged as an accomplice. Not long after, another man, Jason Autry, was taken into custody. Each new name deepened the town's disbelief. These weren't strangers or drifters. They were locals, men who'd sat in the same diners, attended the same churches, fished the same rivers. People recognized them. That was the hardest part. In a community built on neighborly trust, realizing that the predator came from within was almost too much to bear. For Marie, the arrests were both salvation and torment. When the TBI agents called her that night, their tone was careful, respectful, cautious. They told her they believed these men were responsible. She thanked them through tears, voice trembling. Then, when the call ended, she sat for a long time in the dark, whispering to herself, "Thank you, Lord, but please, not this way." Eights, psychologically, it's one of the cruel paradoxes of justice. Families who wait years for answers often imagine closure as relief, but when it finally comes, it cuts deeper than the mystery ever did. The unknown hurts, but the truth can destroy. Investigators, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to connect the dots. Evidence gathered over years, cell phone pings, witness statements, and physical traces began aligning into a horrifying mosaic. Jason Autry, the third man arrested, turned out to be the key. Facing decades in prison on unrelated charges, Autry began to talk. He told investigators details only someone involved could know, details that had never been released to the public. The statements were chilling. Where they'd taken Holly, what they'd done, how they'd hidden her. The community's collective psyche cracked. For years, they'd prayed together in candlelight vigils, convinced that the evil that took Holly had long since fled. Now they learned it had been sitting in the pews beside them. Churchgoers looked at one another differently. Conversations turned guarded. The kind smiles that once defined small-town Tennessee were replaced by cautious glances. No one said it aloud, but everyone thought it. If I didn't see this coming, what else am I blind to? In the days after the arrests, Parsons felt like a ghost town. The same streets that had once overflowed with search volunteers were now lined with parked cars and drawn curtains. People didn't gather to pray anymore. They gathered to whisper. The psychological shock extended far beyond the Bobos. Teachers, pastors, shop owners, everyone felt implicated, as if they'd failed to notice the darkness festering among them. Collective guilt replaced collective hope. In interviews, Marie described her feelings as half thankfulness, half heartbreak. She had long begged for answers, now she had them, but they brought no comfort. "I wanted justice," she told a local reporter. But justice means admitting she's gone. Eights. At the TBI, the case files that had once collected dust were now bursting with activity. Investigators processed new evidence from search warrants, vehicles, cell phones, even shovels recovered from the suspects' properties. Each item, mundane in isolation, became monstrous when tied to Holly's name. Finally, the cold case files burned with new life and new horror. For detectives like Terry Dykes, the breakthrough came with mixed emotions. He'd spent years chasing ghosts. Now, the ghosts had names. The sense of satisfaction that should have followed never arrived. "You wait your whole career for a case like this to break," he later said. "And when it does, you wish it hadn't." As details of the investigation leaked, the town's fragile faith cracked further. The report spoke of captivity, of suffering, of a young woman's courage in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Each revelation peeled away another layer of innocence from the community that had once been defined by kindness. For Marie, the nights grew longer. She still lit her candle, but now the prayer had changed. It wasn't "bring her home" anymore. It was Give me strength to face what's coming. 8. Friends and neighbors rallied around her, but they too were processing betrayal. People who had shared casseroles with the Addams family during fundraisers now found themselves disgusted by the thought of it. It wasn't just grief, it was revulsion, the sickening realization that evil can wear an ordinary face. True crime experts would later describe the Holly Bobo case as a turning point in how Americans perceive small-town safety. It shattered the illusion that horror belonged to big cities or late-night highways. Here, it had walked through familiar doors in broad daylight. And for the people of Parsons, that truth would never fade. The courtroom phase was still months away, but the emotional verdict had already been delivered. The town that once united in prayer was now divided by suspicion and rage. At church the following Sunday, Pastor Steve Neal spoke carefully. "Evil does not always come with horns and shadows," he said. "Sometimes it comes with a smile, and a handshake, and a neighbor's wave." 8. His words hung in the air like a sermon no one wanted to hear. Would you have suspected them? Comment your first impression before we reach the verdict. As the suspects were escorted into their preliminary hearings, reporters jostled for photos. The images, orange jumpsuits, blank expressions, became symbols of a betrayal that would haunt the region for years. Outside the courthouse, Marie stood quietly with Dana and Clint. She didn't look at the cameras. Her gaze was fixed on the doors where the men who had destroyed her world would soon emerge. "I prayed for this day," she whispered. "And I hate that I did." 8. Her words summed up everything the community felt: relief poisoned by grief, faith cracked by reality. That day marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The trial. But as Parsons prepared to confront its demons in court, one truth lingered like smoke in the air, the kind you can't see but can still smell, long after the fire has burned out. 8. The monsters had always been there. They just learned how to blend in. The year was 2017, 6 years since Holly Bobo had walked into the woods and vanished. Time had dulled the edges of pain, but not the wound itself. When the trial finally began inside the Hardin County Courthouse, Parsons felt as if it had been holding its breath for years, and now, at last, it could exhale, even if what came next would hurt. Outside, the courthouse steps were lined with cameras and reporters. The familiar blue-gray TBI jacket stood at every entrance, a silent reminder of how long the road to this day had been. Inside, the courtroom was still, the air thick with anticipation. Rows of wooden pews were filled with locals, investigators, and strangers who had followed the story from the beginning. In the front row sat Marie Bobo, flanked by her husband Dana and her son Clint. Her face was calm, her hands folded over a worn Bible that she had carried since Holly's disappearance. Observers noted the same thing, how still she was, how unshaken. But inside, her heart beat like a drum she couldn't quiet. Across the room sat Zachary Addams, the man accused of kidnapping, raping, and murdering her daughter. His expression was vacant, no remorse, no fear, just a hollow stare. Beside him, his defense attorneys shuffled papers, whispering occasionally, their client unmoved by the gravity of the trial unfolding around him. When the jury entered, the silence deepened. Every creak of a bench, every shuffled footstep echoed like thunder. The prosecution began with a simple, devastating statement. This case is about the abduction and murder of a young woman whose only crime was kindness. 8. They showed photos of Holly as she had been, smiling, radiant, alive. Then they showed evidence of the life she lost. Maps of the area where her remains were found. Photos of recovered items, a piece of her clothing, the remains of a lunch bag. The air grew heavier with each exhibit. For the first time, the jury and the public heard the words that had been hidden in sealed files for years. Words taken from Jason Autry's testimony, the man who had once stood beside the accused. Autry took the stand with his head slightly bowed, his voice calm, almost detached. He wasn't a man racked by guilt. He was a man trying to survive his own past. His plea deal required him to tell the truth, or at least a version of it. He described that April morning in horrifying detail, how Zachary Adams had lured Holly, how fear turned to violence, how the woods that once cradled her childhood became her final resting place. He spoke as if reading a shopping list, his tone devoid of emotion. To many watching, it was worse than hearing rage or tears. It was the absence of humanity. Marie Bobo gripped the edge of her pew, knuckles white, face pale. She didn't cry. She wouldn't give him that power. Instead, she focused on the cross at the front of the courtroom, her lips moving silently in prayer. You'd hold your breath with every word from the witness stand, wondering how much truth a heart can take. Autry's confession was the turning point. His testimony aligned with phone records, forensic evidence, and cell tower data. Step by step, the prosecution built a narrative so solid, so devastating, that even seasoned courtroom reporters were stunned. But the defense fought hard. They attacked Autry's credibility, reminding the jury that he was a criminal himself, a man testifying in exchange for leniency. They argued that he had fabricated parts of his story to save his own life. They painted Zachary Adams as a convenient scapegoat, a victim of rumor and public anger. Still, the weight of evidence was undeniable. The physical traces, the confessions, the testimonies all pointed to the same grim truth. Through it all, Marie never looked away. Even when the details became unbearable, the descriptions of how Holly was held, how she had fought, she sat steady. Her faith was not naive. It was armor. She had already endured the unimaginable. There was nothing left the world could take from her except the truth, and she wanted every painful inch of it. Psychologists later described Marie's composure as a form of post-traumatic resilience, the ability to transform pain into strength. But it wasn't effortless. Every calm breath was an act of defiance. In contrast, Jason Autry's demeanor represented moral decay, a man so hollowed out by his own choices that conscience no longer had a voice. He didn't apologize. He didn't cry. His detachment chilled everyone in the room. It's one thing to hear about evil. It's another to see it speaking calmly under oath. The courtroom spectators sat frozen, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself refused to move. Some closed their eyes. Others clenched their fists. When the prosecution rested its case, the defense had little left but desperation. They called a few witnesses, argued technicalities, questioned timelines, but each attempt seemed to crumble under the weight of evidence. And then came closing arguments. The prosecutor stood tall, voice steady, eyes fixed on the jury. "This isn't just about one family's grief," he said. "It's about a community betrayed from within. About a young woman whose kindness met cruelty. About justice delayed, but not denied." "Eights." He paused, scanning the faces of the jurors, the Bobos, the reporters scribbling furiously. It's rare for a cold case file to end with a verdict this clear and this devastating. "Eights." When he sat down, the courtroom remained silent. Even the defense had nothing left to say that could undo what everyone had heard. The judge's instructions to the jury were brief, but heavy. Deliberate carefully, weigh the evidence, and remember the life at the center of it all. Hours later, though it felt like days, word spread that the jury had reached a verdict. The hallway outside the courtroom filled with whispers, prayers, and shaking hands. Inside, the Bobos sat close, fingers intertwined. Marie closed her eyes as the jury filed back in. The foreman stood. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. On the charge of first-degree murder. He paused. The silence stretched until it seemed the walls might crack. Guilty. Eights. A single sob escaped from the gallery, then another, then another. On the charge of especially aggravated kidnapping. Eights Doe guilty. Eights. On the charge of aggravated sexual battery. Eights guilty. Eights. Each word landed like a hammer, driving 6 years of grief into something solid at last. Zachary Adams showed no emotion. He sat as still as he had on day one, his expression an empty void. The lack of reaction only deepened the horror. Even as the words sealed his fate, he seemed untouched by them. Across the room, Marie pressed her hand to her mouth. Clint reached for her other hand, his tears falling freely now. Dana's shoulders shook silently beside them. It wasn't victory. It was the end of a nightmare they'd been forced to live awake. When the judge thanked the jury for their service, the courtroom exhaled. Reporters rushed outside to broadcast the news. The streets of Parsons erupted with mixed emotions: relief, sorrow, exhaustion. In interviews afterward, one juror said, "It wasn't about punishment. It was about acknowledgement. We wanted to make sure the world knew what happened to that girl." Eights. As sentencing followed, the outcome was inevitable. Life without parole plus 50 years. For the first time in 6 years, the Bobos allowed themselves to breathe without waiting for the next call, the next lead, the next cruel rumor. Justice had come, imperfect, delayed, but real. And yet, as they walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight, Marie knew that justice and peace are not the same thing. Justice closes the case. Peace has to be rebuilt from the ruins. Outside, the crowd gathered around them, reporters, neighbors, strangers who'd followed Holly's story since the beginning. Marie smiled softly, thanked them for their prayers, and said only one thing: "Justice has been served. Now, let's remember her life, not just her death." Eights. The camera lights caught the tear on her cheek as she turned away. If you believe justice still matters, hit that subscribe button, because stories like this deserve to be remembered. When the verdict was read and Zachary Adams was led away in handcuffs, the courtroom finally exhaled. Years of tension, fear, and unanswered questions had been pressed into those two words: guilty, guilty. But once the echoes faded, what lingered was not victory. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when you realize justice doesn't end the story. It just changes it. In the months that followed, Marie Bobo found herself standing at a crossroads most people could never imagine. She had spent years praying for justice, years fighting exhaustion, facing cameras, repeating her daughter's name so the world wouldn't forget it. And now that justice had arrived, it felt strangely hollow. The nights were still long. The house was still too quiet. The coffee pot still brewed for 3 instead of 4. And though Holly's killers were locked away, her absence remained, an open wound that even a guilty verdict couldn't stitch closed. But Marie had always been more than her grief. She realized that healing isn't forgetting. It's learning to live beside the pain. That summer, she made a decision that would change the way people remembered her daughter, and perhaps change how other families survived tragedy. Instead of retreating into isolation, Marie began speaking publicly about missing persons cases. She volunteered with organizations that helped other parents enduring the same nightmares she had lived through. Her first speech was at a small church outside Nashville. The room was half full, mostly families, detectives, and counselors. Marie stood at the podium, clutching her notes, her voice trembling for only the first few seconds. Then something inside her steadied. "I thought justice would heal me," she said softly. But it didn't. Justice gives answers. Healing comes when you use those answers to help someone else. 8. From that day on, Marie became an advocate. She met with state legislators about faster response protocols for missing persons. She worked with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation to establish community education programs. And every April, she organized a memorial walk in Parsons, a living tribute to Holly's life. The walk began at New Hope Baptist Church, the same place where thousands had gathered years earlier to pray for Holly's safe return. The route wound through town, passing the high school, the nursing program Holly had loved, and finally the cemetery where she was laid to rest. The first year, a few dozen people came. The next, a few hundred. By 2022, the walk drew participants from across the state, strangers who had never met Holly, but who felt her story in their hearts. Along the route, posters displayed photos of other missing persons, reminders that the fight for justice was far from over. Each photo carried a message. Don't give up. Someone still cares. 8. Dana Bobo, quieter than his wife but just as dedicated, volunteered for search and rescue efforts in other Tennessee cases. He said it was his way of honoring Holly, to make sure no other family waited as long as they did for answers. Clint, after years of therapy, began speaking to young people about awareness and safety. "You can't save the past," he told one high school group, "but you can protect someone else's future." 8. Through their collective pain, the Bobo family built something stronger than fear, a legacy of action. Every candle lit in Holly's name now symbolized not just remembrance, but resistance against silence, against apathy, against evil that hides in plain sight. Marie's story began appearing on panels and true crime conferences, where law enforcement officers cited the Bobo case as an example of perseverance, how family pressure and public persistence kept the case alive long enough for breakthroughs to happen. One FBI analyst who attended one of Marie's talks later said, "She didn't speak like a victim. She spoke like someone who had walked through fire and found light on the other side." 8. Every cold case file is a scar on time, proof that evil can hide, but truth never dies. And for Marie, truth had become a calling. She carried Holly's memory like a banner, not as a tragedy, but as a purpose. Her advocacy led to the creation of the Holly Bobo Memorial Scholarship, awarded annually to nursing students who demonstrated compassion and resilience. The scholarship ceremony was always emotional. Each year, a new student would step up to the podium and thank the Bobo family, their voices breaking as they promised to carry forward Holly's dream of helping others heal. Some of those recipients would later write letters to Marie, saying the scholarship had inspired them to work in trauma care, hospice nursing, or rural outreach. In that way, Holly's compassion, the one that had drawn her to nursing in the first place, continued saving lives, even years after her own had been taken. But even advocates have moments of weakness. There were nights when Marie returned home from a conference and sat quietly at her kitchen table, staring at Holly's empty chair. She still kept her daughter's favorite cup, still folded her old nursing uniform neatly in a drawer. Grief never truly left, it just changed shape. In psychology, they call it grief transformation, when mourning becomes mission, when the pain of loss evolves into purpose. It's not about letting go, it's about holding on differently. Marie had become the embodiment of that idea. In interviews, she spoke of faith not as something that protected her from suffering, but something that helped her endure it. "I don't ask God why anymore," she once told a reporter. "I just ask Him to use it for good." 8. Her quiet strength drew others in, mothers who had lost children, detectives who had lost faith, students searching for meaning. They all found something steady in her presence, something that said, "You can survive this too." Each April 13th, the anniversary of Holly's disappearance, the family gathered for a small private ceremony. They didn't hold press events anymore. No cameras, no microphones. Just a circle of family and close friends at the gravesite, the air heavy with both memory and peace. Marie always brought fresh pink roses, Holly's favorite. Dana read a verse from Psalms. Clint lit a single white candle and whispered, "We're still here, sis." 8. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the soft light from that candle flickered against the granite headstone. For years, that same candle had burned inside the Bobo home, day and night, flame never extinguished. It had become their ritual of remembrance, their symbol of eternal love. Visitors often said the house felt different, not haunted, but holy, as if grief had somehow been transformed into grace. The flame wasn't large. It didn't need to be. It was steady. And in that steady light, you could almost see the outline of what the family had rebuilt, not the life they lost, but the strength they found. As the memorial walk grew, so did the movement it inspired. Other Tennessee families began organizing similar events. Advocacy groups partnered with law enforcement to share missing persons alerts faster. Churches hosted workshops on trauma support. What began as one woman's vow to honor her daughter had rippled outward, touching lives far beyond Parsons. Marie never sought fame. She never wanted her name in headlines again. All she wanted was to ensure that when people heard Holly Bobo, they thought not of death, but of light. In interviews, when asked how she managed to keep going, Marie would smile softly and say, "I keep my eyes on the candle." 8. Because that's what healing had become, not forgetting, not moving on, but walking beside the flame and carrying it forward. The story of Holly Bobo had begun with fear and silence, but it ended with faith and purpose. The cold case that once defined despair had become a symbol of endurance, a reminder that darkness never wins when love refuses to die. Stay with us till the end, because what the Bobo family built from their grief will change how you see hope. Even after all these years, Clint Bobo still remembers that morning. The dew on the grass, the quiet hum of birds before the day began, and the sight of his sister walking toward the woods, sunlight glinting off her blonde hair. For years, that image had been a wound he couldn't touch. But now, it's become something different, a symbol. In his mind, she's no longer walking away. She's walking home. The candle still burns inside the Bobo house, a small, steady flame that has never gone out. It's more than memory. It's endurance. It's faith. It's truth refusing to be buried. Every night, when Marie lights it, she isn't mourning anymore. She's honoring. Because love, when tested by darkness, becomes something indestructible. Outside, the Tennessee night is still. The town that once trembled now sleeps in peace. But the story of Holly Bobo, her courage, her family's strength, and the justice that rose from despair continues to ripple far beyond Parsons. Her light reaches anyone who's ever lost someone and kept believing anyway. You've just walked through one of America's most unforgettable cold case files, a story not just of tragedy, but of transformation. Maybe tonight, you'll double-check your door or whisper a prayer for the ones still missing. Because evil may hide for a time, but truth, like a flame, never stops reaching for the light. So, if you believe every story deserves to be remembered, if you believe justice still matters, 8. Subscribe to Cold Case Files, where every story is a light for those still lost in the dark.